Welcome to The Voice of Retail. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc. This podcast is brought to you in conjunction with Retail Council of Canada. Live from my podcasting studio high above the Vegas Sands during Shoptalk 2022, I sit down and talk about the latest news and developments in the global e-commerce industry with two of the sharpest minds in the space. Allen and Jim Okamura, consultants, advisors, industry analysts, and co-founders of the Global eCommerce Leaders Forum, are back as my special guests in person together for an exclusive interview in my Las Vegas podcasting studio. We catch up and talk about the latest developments in global e-commerce, including the moves China is making internationally, the echo boom of worldwide e-commerce, and the upcoming GELF LA event on April 21, which is open now to all retailers to apply to attend.
I think one of the biggest trends we're seeing is just this rise of direct-to-consumer from a global perspective. And we've talked about cross-border e-commerce since we started 7-8 years ago, Jim.
Yeah.
And I'd say right now, one of the bigger trends is just this idea that, brands, especially some of these smaller upstart direct-to-consumer brands are global out of the gate.
It's great to see you both co-founders of GELF, Global eCommerce Leaders Forum, and thought we'd catch up and share with the people what's going on in global e-commerce. You've got an event coming up. What are the big trends that you're thinking about? Why don't we start where we always start with tell us a bit about yourselves. Kent, who are you and what do you do? You've been on the pod. Welcome back. You've both been on the podcast before. So Kent, give us a quick overview of who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And great to be back out with the e-commerce community in full force. Boy, I guess I've been around this community since the late 90s when Jim and Scott and I, along with, kind of the first generation of the e-commerce folks, started actually building this industry. So it's just great to see a lot of young people, a lot of energy, and it's great to see the folks that are back and we haven't seen in 3 years. But yeah, so when I'm not doing industry analyst work, I have been heads down on building the global e-commerce leaders community, and it's been great to see it grow. Obviously, with the boom in e-commerce over the last 2 years, as we've all sheltered in place in different ways, shapes, and forms, there's been an echo boom in cross-border. However, at the same time, there are challenges out there as well, and opportunity meets challenges is what the Global eCommerce Leaders Forum is all about, or GELF as we call it.
I love that concept of an echo boom, because we've often talked about on the Global eCommerce Leaders podcast about how e-commerce moved from kind of the sideshow to the main stage, and that's that movement that we're heading in that direction, certainly pretty aggressively for global e-commerce, and that's hence why you guys got into this, right? Moving from, the small ancillary kind of work to, wow, this is now pretty important, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest trends we're seeing is just this rise of direct-to-consumer from a global perspective. And we've talked about cross-border e-commerce since we started 7-8 years ago, Jim.
Yeah.
And I'd say right now, one of the bigger trends is just this idea that, brands, especially some of these smaller upstart direct-to-consumer brands are global out of the gate. They're depending heavily on social to get the word out. And they have to be able to serve customers from all around the world from day one, which is a big difference from where we started, which was, hey, should we even bother with these international people that are showing up at our site? How did they even find us? And, we have to tabulate tariffs and things like that.
Yeah, right on. All right, Jim, tell us about yourself. Jim, you and I have known each other a long time, so it's great to...
Long time.
Great to have you on the mic.
It's great to be here. Again, I think back to when you were the first, general manager at HBC.com, and we try to gather the handful of, Canadian, executives basically who were even involved in the digital retail, space. What change we've seen over the years. I'm Jim Okamura. I'm a co-founder with Kent and Scott on the Global eCommerce Leaders Forum. But really, I've been doing retail consulting, strategy consulting work for in the past 25 years. Most of that in the digital space. So certainly, it's been really great to see just the evolution over time, and that's where you kind of pointed out. We talked about this in the past. That echo boom that we see, in kind of the international space, we have seen, so a lot of parallels to the early days of digital retail or e-commerce, in general. And I think it's where we're certainly trying to again, raise the profile of international growth opportunities for retailers and brands. And I think, that's exactly where we're as anxious as anyone to see, as we kind of, come out of the pandemic, how, what will be the response of some of these companies? We've definitely seen, for many companies, they had to backburner some international, initiatives to really focus on, domestic, just take care
keeping
of
up with the volume of domestic stuff, right?
Exactly. And yet there were others, who did kind of the opposite and doubled down on, some of their international opportunities as, e-commerce grew around the world. And if they had a brand that carried well, then all of a sudden they were getting all these demand cues that I think, where they, feel like they have to, kind of go after. So it's really going to be interesting to see as we, everyone kind of comes back to, okay, what is this kind of post-pandemic, retailing world going to look like? And certainly, we are biased, but we certainly feel that it's going to become even more borderless.
Oh, interesting. Kent, we're here at Shoptalk. What brings you both to Shoptalk specifically, other than the Vegas weather and the chance to see people in person? Is there any? I think you got a partnership going on.
Yes,
with,
we do.
Shoptalk,
we,
right?
Shout out to the team at Shoptalk. We've been partners over the years with them, and it's been great that they extend such courteousness to a small event like ourselves. But it's just really encouraging to see everybody back, and they've done a great job of billing this as a reunion, and it really does feel like a reunion. And even though we've been out at a couple of events, GELF New York got back going again last September. Obviously then along came a variant, and, even our LA event, which was originally mid-February, has now been pushed to April 21st. And I know we'll talk a little bit about that. But I think as much as anything, just getting back out and, hearing what the big picture trends are, in some ways they are very much aligned with what we're seeing from our, kind of global D2C cross-border perspective. But, the whole retail media thing is obviously a big buzz around here today, and that, is something we can think about. And, global omnichannel is something we've been talking about really as a future, if you will. So I think after all the investment that we've seen in curbside pickup and buy online and pick up in store and just making that store a more integral hub within the digital world is going to tee up some interesting talks down the road for us at GELF events.
Right on. Jim, when we think about the big trends that you're going to cover, so the event is, let's hit that event date a couple of times. So GELF LA, it's coming up April 21st and 22nd, right, in LA?
It's just the 21st. It's all day, Thursday to the 21st. So we'll start early and we'll go late, but the day flies by. But it's a great venue. We're back on Sunset Boulevard at the Directors Guild of America, where we've done probably our last, 5 events in LA there.
Now, let's talk about the model a little bit for the event. So for the folks who are listening to the podcast, if you're a retailer, you're welcome to the event. If you're a service provider, it's a partnership, right? So you can't buy a ticket. And that really, and I'm saying this because it's a shout out to the retailers who would want to go. The percentage of retailers in that audience is very high. So you'll see a lot of your colleagues who do what you do for a living, right? Yeah,
that's really how GELF has developed as a community. We modeled it on the really early days of the first e-commerce events like shop.org, back when there was, one person on the retail team looking at e-commerce. And when we started GELF, there was, maybe one or half a person on the e-commerce team looking at international opportunities. So the question was, how can we bring these folks together? How can we make it as easy as possible for retail executives to come together? And, we big shout out to our sponsors, because we can't do it without our sponsors. We don't charge retailers and brands to come. We want to make it as friction-free as possible. So, you can go to globalecommerceleadersforum.com. Click on the link for our LA event. It's really easy to sign up.
So basically, as a retailer, you're applying to come. You're not. You kind of give your bona fides, and you guys check them out, and then you're in, right? Yeah,
so it's really easy. We encourage you guys to share with us what you're interested in talking about. Believe it or not, a lot of what our registrations tell us is how we frame the day's events and the program. And Jim works really hard on pulling together some cool end of the day roundtables, and we're just thrilled with, the speakers and all the experts that are willing to share their time and join us in LA. So really looking forward to getting because, we haven't been there since, 2020.
Yeah.
We were one of the last e-commerce events before the pandemic hit, and it was by far our best West Coast event. It was interesting. We had a nice partnership with Alibaba. China was a big topic, and yet, we knew something was going on at that time. So it's crazy that it's, 2 years later and we're finally getting back. And, again, wasn't like there weren't hiccups because we already had to postpone the mid-February event to April 21st.
Yeah.
And just to maybe give a shout out to some of the Canadian content, certainly, we see very consistently, with the brands and retailers, who are in our community, where Canada is, often by far the biggest, international market. So, we always, hear from, these companies who are looking to do more, for their Canadian, shopper. And I think, that those are all the good signs, that we're seeing, that there is greater attention and resources being committed to again, stand up a better customer experience, whether they're a Canadian shopper or British or Australian or anywhere else, in the world. So
let me follow on that point. Who should go to your conference from a retailer perspective? What's your job title and what's your remit?
Yeah, I think, we've always worked really hard to try to, cover the entire customer journey from top of the funnel, product discovery and marketing, all the way through the experience, on site, and then all the through the checkout and post purchase experience, and so. What you tend to find that we've got, a really nice, mix of, titles coming out in our community, from, the general manager or VP or SVP of e-commerce down through, marketing, managers or directors, and operations,
logistics,
people,
folks
and the
move
logistics
stuff around
side.
the world, yeah.
Payments, are obviously a big part of, kind of global e-commerce and being able to localize things. So we'll get into payments and fraud, and how challenging that can be in certain, markets. So, yeah, it really is, that's been one of our both, challenges and pleasures, is that we know that it's important to kind of, not just talk about the front end, as much as, really that entire, journey. And we know that it takes, a village for any of these, brands to really stand up a good experience. And in often case, it's done through the partnership, with the solution provider community, because, most companies wouldn't be able to handle all the intricacies, of, international or cross-border, or, as Kent, mentioned, things like the duties and tariffs, without these partners. So I think that's really what has made, GELF, like I think a true community, is that we've kind of, allowed people to mix and speak openly. And I think, that's really resulted in, lots of good partnerships from everything that we hear.
So, Kent, what are we going to be talking about? What are we going to be hearing at the event? What are the big things? What are the big themes that are coming out that will be on the stage on April 21st?
Yeah, I mean, it's been great because, we've had the privilege of talking to a lot of our speakers over the last couple of weeks as we've been, doing some prep calls and just, reconnecting and things like that. I mean, Jim made a great point, Speaking of the echo boom, Canadian e-commerce, guys, is booming, would you not say?
Yeah, absolutely. 70% growth domestically, and now we're actually on par growth-wise with the U.S., and we caught up, basically. So now it's a very much a level playing field, so to speak, between the two in terms of importance and priority.
That being said, there are challenges getting across that Canadian border, not pandemic related, but old school challenges. So in fact, shout out to the passport shipping guys who are working with us to develop an afternoon session where we'll be looking at, overcoming some of those challenges of shipping into Canada.
And there's opportunities for Canadian retailers shipping in to the U.S. because there's a clause in the agreement. What is it? Section 23?
321, right?
Section 321. So if you're listening and you want to do more business in the U.S., there's some pretty important rules there that will really help you, right? Yeah.
In fact, we're looking at developing some more content on that after the event as well. I know that there have been a lot of people trying to figure out the whole kind of especially when you sit and you look at the ports outside of L.A. and even San Francisco, as people got bottlenecked during the holidays. There was, in fact, we've got the folks from the Edmonton airport coming to talk about how you can actually fly stuff into Edmonton, put it on a truck, and get it to places and get around some bottlenecks. So, other big topics, geographically, as I mentioned last time, we were in LA. We talked a lot about China. We're actually not talking about China quite as much right now, but Europe has been a big topic. And, sometimes when it's a big topic at GELF, that means that there are challenges to overcome. And whether it's Brexit or some of the other regulatory changes, people are trying to figure out what's going on in Europe. What are their opportunities?
Right, I forgot about, Brexit. It's funny, right? That was only, April? That was only 4 months ago that Brexit changed dramatically, right?
Yeah, that's a topic that we've been hearing a lot from the speakers. What's going on, too, is that, international shipping, no surprise to anyone, and global supply chain in general has been in the news, you could say, I guess.
You could say. One or two articles a minute.
Yeah, over the last 6 months or so. So it is definitely getting to the point where people are revisiting. Well, one of the big themes is people are revisiting, or as some people say, redefining global e-commerce. What's it mean to them? But they're also.
What do you mean? Expand on that a bit.
I think I'll pick up on what Jim was saying out of the gate. We definitely saw some people. Interestingly enough, so GELF 2020, we had 4 people on stage in our early kind of executive leaders keynote panel, all of whom were kind of getting ready to double down on international. They were seeing the big opportunity. Along came the pandemic, and at least 2 of them pretty much put international on hold, or didn't really put it on hold, but just had to redeploy their assets elsewhere. And again, this whole idea of
basically to domestic
curbside, taking care of the stores. They had to kind of lock down and look out for job number 1, which was taking care of the domestic business. So that's one way, but I think that people are also reinventing global because it's not something that they can decide when or where they want to invest in. They know that it's just part of their business, period. And, for a long time at GELF, we've talked about how challenging it can be when the CFO comes in and says, well, the ROI I run on investing in domestic versus international shows the return's going to be on domestic. And the counter to that is, yes, but in 5 or 10 years, you may not have an international opportunity. We've seen, especially in Latin America, where some of the China trade lanes have really eroded future opportunities for brands to get into international markets. So there's always been that.
What do you mean by that? Expand on that a little bit. So, because there's not, as I was looking through the agenda, there's not a lot of LATAM on the agenda in LA. No,
you're right about that.
So what's because we've had the guys from Mercado Libre, we've had some other folks on the GELF, the Global Tech Talks podcast. So what's the thinking about?
And Jim, jump in here because I know you've been doing or seeing a lot of work, especially into Mexico. So while I would say Canada and Mexico have benefited a lot.
Sure.
If you look deeper into Latin America, whether it's Brazil or Colombia, again, had a conversation earlier today about strong growth that folks are seeing in Colombia right now. However, AliExpress, some of the other not special lanes really, but dedicated lanes. So essentially what you see is if Americans just kind of wait for others to prove that there's an opportunity in Latin America, they may miss out on being able to establish their brand. They may be seeing resistance from another trend that we've been talking a lot about, which is these new brands coming out of China. Same people that are making outdoor gear for well-known brands
like
from
Shine
Canada.
Or whoever.
Exactly.
The fast
fashion stuff. So,
So what you're saying is you're perceiving that they're crowding out opportunities in Latin America because they've got a real focus on building down there.
They're not waiting. They're not waiting to, copy what other people do. They're getting in there. They're establishing their brand. They're grabbing, big business on some of the Latin marketplaces. Jim, what are you guys seeing in Mexico?
I think that's exactly right, where, I think it is a bit of a land grab at this point, right? And those who are kind of eyeing emerging markets like LATAM in general, but probably more specifically certain, countries, within the Latin American region, I think, there's an opportunity right now to kind of, get in early, establish yourself. And for some of these, Asian brands, really, I think for them to kind of all of a sudden establish themselves, ahead of, perhaps some better known, global brands, whether they're coming from Europe or the U.S. or Canada. So I think it's just really interesting, when you kind of think about it from a bigger picture, longer term, perspective. I mean, it is a strategic bet that you're placing, that you hope will pay off, well down the line. But we always say that, it does take, I think, a lot of courage, for any, company or brand to really commit these resources, because, it is going, in often cases, it's going to be a longer kind of, a path, to profitability. I think that's what makes it interesting when you start to see, okay, well, the different types of ways you can go to market through digital channels. And that's
we used to say the same thing about domestic e-commerce, right? I mean,
Totally.
I've had lots of CFOs come and visit my office and go, man, we're not making anywhere near what we should be compared to. I said, well, it's basically it is a bet on where we're going to be in 5 years, not where we are today, right?
Or 10 years.
Or 10 years.
And I think that's exactly where, the pandemic years, really, have spiked the e-commerce, penetrations around the world so much that all of a sudden those numbers start to again, look, quite differently when, it's the same thing when we're looking at, a Canadian market opportunity. Now that, the e-commerce penetration is so high and it's become a very normal shopping, behavior.
And the ecosystem has grown up too, right? I think both domestically and internationally. I mean, that was my learning at sitting through your events and doing the podcast together. Is there's all these great providers who just smooth these friction points out, whether it's currency or taxation. And these things are just very hard to figure out on your own, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting as I look back at, Jim and I have been looking at this opportunity since we did the first benchmarking report back in, 2008. And, we've just seen another kind of consolidation. Again, the cross-border space is not a huge space in the e-commerce world, but it's an important one. In fact, back to your question about, what are some of the things that we're talking about? Well, we were well on our way to getting the program ready when we were originally going to do it in February when Globally and Flow came together,
right.
Two, leaders in the space. So that's part of the morning program. We're going to have Rob from Flow, who's now, kind of senior at Globally. We'll be featuring a client, Athletic Propulsion Labs, talking a little bit about the work that they've done. And, interestingly enough, NJ Fox, great speaker. They've done some really cool stuff. But what we were talking about back in December was, how they were starting to find opportunities during the holiday shopping season from markets around the world that they hadn't really looked at until they did some testing. So I know Rob and NJ will talk a little bit about that on stage, but, they'll also talk about what's next as far as Globally coming together with Flow. And, at the same time, we're seeing, kind of new opportunities, new platforms emerge and things like that. So, whenever there's some consolidation in the space, that opens up opportunities for other folks. We've got the team from Scale Fast that's joining us. They are scaling fast and growing quickly. And in fact, Dan and his team are kind of helping us out in the afternoon. We are going to look at the metaverse, so it's not just looking at tariffs and taxes and international shipping and all.
Can't have a conference these days without talking about the metaverse.
Well, it's going to be interesting. Looking at there's not as many borders that we know of yet in the metaverse, but who knows? Maybe there'll be big bad borders in the metaverse that we don't even know about yet. So, we're starting the conversation there. So I think one of the interesting things about the metaverse is the opportunities for the luxury brands. As they look at digital product and, as you'll hear in the session, we'll talk a lot about this idea of, the endless catalog. In the metaverse, something that people haven't really thought about.
Is that like the endless aisle? Jim, you and I talked about the endless aisle 20 years ago. Is that the latest version?
It does seem to be endless, but yes.
The endless conversation about the endless aisles.
Yes, I do think, product. This is taking product selection to the next, level.
All right. Cool. All right. Well, listen. So who else you got on the stage? Throw some names out.
So what else? So we're opening up the day. We've got a great opening executive panel. We got Angela Clark, who has just moved over to Patagonia. Very nice for her to kind of help us kick off the day. We got Zach Goldstein from Public Rec, Kelly Swanson from Reformation, Elizabeth Krause from Speedo. They're really kicking off the day. A couple of these folks joined us during the pandemic. Talked a little bit about how that was impacting their business. I think one of the key takeaways from the opening session, other than, how are you reprioritizing? What are the key markets? And I'll get to that in a second because that runs throughout the day. But just this idea of how are you building the team? And you know, Jim, you've done a lot on the org design part. So, you know, this idea of coming out of the pandemic, we've learned how to work together on Zoom, and that's actually been really helpful for international teams who have had to rely on, you know, non-face-to-face you know, team building and things like that. Jim, I know you've got some org design stuff that you've been hearing in some of these speaker prep calls.
Yeah, no, I think it is interesting just to hear from some of these global e-commerce leaders, you know, as they've talked about how they're working differently across regions, right? So I think, you know, just where for a big global brand, you know, you may have, you know, totally decentralized operations, but to sort of work across from the North American, you know, business unit with EMEA or APAC. I think it's really interesting just to see how they've been, you know, for example, buying from each other's merchandising lines, right? And just kind of almost, you know, doing that counter seasonal, you know, merchandising, you know, in that way. But I think just overall this greater willingness to kind of for cross-functional collaboration. Again, something we've talked about for decades now, right? You know, that's so critical within certainly any omni-channel kind of, you know, execution.
The cross-pollination of skills and cultures too, right? I mean, it is a different culture. I can't have both of you on the mic without talking about a little bit about current events, because I think we were talking off mic about the war in the Ukraine. And how does that, in your early assessment, and your early assessment, start to impact global commerce? More and more I'm hearing it's the end of global, you know, the global world, the global connected world, not global commerce, but you know, the globalization. It's the end of globalization as we know it, but that means there's another version of globalization coming. Any early thoughts on the impact and of what's happening? I mean, clearly you've got brands, you know, exiting Russia. You know, that's one, you know, very straightforward impact, but then now you've got supply chain and logistics. Maybe it's more important now to get into Europe.
I mean, it's interesting you bring it up because, you know, this was, you know, even before anything happened, we had noticed that as we were, again, talking to companies about, you know, how are they reprioritizing or you know, reinventing or redefining their global e-commerce plans, you know, Europe seemed to be a bigger part of the strategy than it had, you know, before the pandemic. Now, part of that is, you know, especially in Southern Europe, and I guess you could argue Eastern Europe, especially Poland, you were starting to see the people that went online during the pandemic stay online. So some of these, you know, I don't hesitate to call them laggard companies, but countries, but some of the countries where the penetration wasn't as high as, you know, certainly Germany and France and the UK.
Like Canada. You could put Canada in that
same idea, you know. So it's like, the question during the first part of the pandemic was like, is all this traffic going to stay online? And largely, yes. I mean, there is a global omni-channel theme that we're going to be weaving through the event as well, and I'll let Jim weigh in on that. But yeah, so Europe has probably, to be honest, sometimes it's like, hey, we need to talk a little bit more about Europe in the past. It's like we can't talk all about China and you know, Southeast Asia. It kind of just emerged organically, and again, this was before the war. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes that's because there are challenges unique to Europe, and you know there can be some challenges, and you know we did come off an administration that wasn't as Europe friendly, maybe as you know we certainly have seen the events in Ukraine really pull together people, and I think sometimes if you look at that from just a high level perspective, it's like, yeah, if we all row in the same direction, we can get things done. So I do have a sense that that's impacting things. Again, to the whole team building, you know, people are learning how to work with their regional teams. This whole kind of centralization versus decentralization, which we always see kind of go back and forth a little bit when we talk about global e-commerce. You know, I think you're seeing people realize it's like, hey, we need to support our European, you know, whether it's retail partners or emerging channel partners and
or technology development partners. There's a lot of tech developed out of places like the Ukraine and
I mean, it wasn't that long ago. I had some guys, developers, you know, meet me for lunch, and they were Ukrainian, and they're like, hey, we can, you know, let people know we've got a lot of good, cheap labor here. So, you know, it's a shame what's going on there. I think another part of the picture of, you know, okay, we don't know what comes next, but, you know, obviously China's in the conversation as well. And, you know, if China doesn't play their cards straight, there could be issues there, and that's a much bigger dynamic. China e-commerce,
India too, right? India's stayed on the sidelines of this too. So there's
India's, I mean, but China's if China makes some interestingly bad decisions, that could really impact some opportunities. We don't think that will happen. I hesitate to say that, Russia's not that important of a cross-border market, because I remember back, in 2014, we were talking about, hey, e-commerce in Russia is about to explode. This is going to be a huge cross-border market. And then obviously we know what happened in 2014 in the southern part of Ukraine. And, Russia hasn't really been on our radar. It comes and goes. People build distribution centers and things like that. But for the most part, we see the China factor is, one that's really important for cross-border. So hopefully everybody makes good decisions.
So it's so interesting listening to you, and thank you both for taking the opportunity to sit down, because on the one hand, you've got China making inroads into LATAM, and on the other hand, there's a few more cards on the table that may play their way out. And I guess we can figure out a little bit of that by the time the fall comes around and your New York event. So get that in your calendars, everyone, now. You're doing another event in New York, September
29th.
September 29th. So, and your LA event is April 21. So the folks still listening to this, if you're a retailer, jump on. Where should they go? What's the URL?
GlobalEcommerceLeadersForum.com.
Perfect.
And go to the LA conference event, site from there, and you can register.
Perfect. Wonderful. All right. Gentlemen, great to have you both on the mic. It's a treat to see you both live and in person, and I wish you continued success and a great event coming up in April. Thanks for tuning into this special episode of The Voice of Retail. If you haven't already, be sure and click and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so new episodes will land automatically twice a week. And check out my other retail industry media properties, the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Conversations with Commerce Next podcast, and the Food Professor podcast with Dr. Sylvain Charlebois. Last but not least, if you're into barbecue, check out my all-new YouTube barbecue show, Last Request Barbecue, with new episodes each and every week. I'm your host, Michael LeBlanc, president of M.E. LeBlanc Company and Maven Media. And if you're looking for more content or want to chat, follow me on LinkedIn or visit my website at meleblanc.co. Have a safe week, everyone.